You would have thought maybe somebody in Britain would have rediscovered this, or the United States, or France itself, or Canada, but it was here in Melbourne. There is a professor who lived in the late 19th century and early 20th century who developed an electoral system which, frankly, is even better than the preferential voting that Australia has. It's a version of preferential voting, and it's what America needs right now to avoid the problem of polarization.
Welcome to Season 2 of our podcast, Presidency, Upending. In Season 1, we followed the American election through an Australian lens, watching closely as history unfolded.
Now the presidency is no longer pending. Donald Trump has been elected and the world has entered a new and uncertain chapter. Many argue that we are at a hinge point in history. The world order has been upended and US democracy itself is being sorely tested. So what does this mean for Australia? How are we going to navigate these unsettling times? And are they truly unprecedented? How can the past help us to understand the future?
As academics, we may not have a crystal ball, but we do know a fair bit about politics, history, and global change. Over the next 12 months, we'll be drawing on that expertise, along with insights from fellow academics, to make sense of a democracy under strain and to consider what might come next.
We're really excited to be bringing you Season 2 of our podcast, Presidency Upending.
Well, for our first episode of this season, we have a real treat.
We were lucky enough to sit down with Professor Ned Foley, who is one of the leading experts on election law in the United States, and he was in Australia for a lecture and some research. It was really a unique opportunity, wasn't it, to speak with someone who has been working on this topic for years and years and years.
And living and breathing United States politics over the contentious election last year and in the period since then, drawing together insights from his time in Australia as well as his rich experience of American politics.
Yeah, exactly.
And to top it all off, he's extremely affable and a great explainer of complicated ideas.
Including, not least, the Electoral College. I mean, we really put him through his paces, didn't we? We covered quite a lot of his career in our conversation. So the Electoral College, the rise of disinformation and disputed elections, and of course the authoritarianism of this new era in the second Trump presidency. So stick around till the very end of the episode where we really delve into Ned's most recent research, where he actually has found spoiler alert, I was going to tell you the answer, but he has a suggestion for how we might or how Americans might find their way out of the polarization in recent elections. It's a very, very good conversation.
Yeah, do please listen.
We hope you enjoy this first episode of Season 2 of Presidency Upending.
Today, it's our pleasure to have Professor Ned Foley on the pod. Professor Foley is currently visiting Australia on a fellowship, undertaking research which we'll hear more about in a moment. But his regular position is as the Ebersold Chair in Constitutional Law at The Ohio State University, where he directs its election law program. Ned has published extensively in high-profile books and journals on topics such as electoral law, campaign finance, and political polarization, and contributed to public debate in prominent outlets, including serving as an on-air election law analyst with the U.S. television stations NBC and MSNBC. Professor Foley took leave from academia to serve as Solicitor General of Ohio in 1999 and 2000. We're delighted to have someone with Ned's breadth of knowledge and experience of American politics on this podcast. Ned, thanks for joining us on Presidency Pending.
Sorry.
No, it's great to be with you. I'm delighted.
You're our first live American. Is that true?
I think that's quite possibly correct.
Thank you very much.
We are very comparative. Our listeners will be interested to know what brings you to Australia, Ned. Let's begin on that point. Can you tell us briefly what you've been researching here and what kinds of things you're digging up and finding?
Sure. Specifically, there is a professor at the University of Melbourne who lived in the late 19th century and early 20th century who developed an electoral system which, frankly, is even better than the preferential voting that Australia has. It's a version of preferential voting, and it's what America needs right now to avoid the problem of polarization. So I came across this Edward Nanson is his name, and I came across him in the research that I was doing, and then I was very fortunate to be able to come to Melbourne and his university to hold the books that he held and to talk about him. And I wish he were better known, certainly in the United States where nobody knows him. But I've been struck that not that many people even know him here in Melbourne.
I must admit that I've not heard of him.
And neither have most people at his own university. So.
Did he leave papers behind there, or is it just an opportunity to be where he was?
No, he did leave papers behind. And there's one paper in particular that he wrote in 1882, which is important, again, not just for Australia and the United States, but really if we could spend maybe more time on this than you want to, but he rediscovered for the whole world a principle of electoral mathematics that had been developed in France in the 18th century, but then had been lost to history because of the turmoil of the French Revolution. And you would have thought maybe somebody in Britain would have rediscovered this, or the United States, or France itself, or Canada, but it was here in Melbourne in 1882 that he published a paper in English, having read the original French in a volume that was in the State Library of Victoria here. And I was able to go to the State Library and see the same volume. And as they say, the rest is history, because he brought these ideas back. And it's called social choice theory. It's a whole branch of social science that really emerged. And Nansen deserves tremendous credit for it.
So I'm going to ask you some broad questions, but perhaps you can come back to Nansen if that's the answer to these questions. And you're obviously somebody who's thought a lot about electoral processes in different democracies, and including Australia and the United States. So can you tell us, what do you think would be like the one thing most important that the United States should take from Australia? And if there's something vice versa, and it sticks in my craw to ask you that, because as you will have heard, Australians are remarkably smug about our electoral system. But I'm sure there's something from the United States that we could take away too to improve our processes.
Well, I think what Australia can and maybe should take away as a warning: don't go down the road that the United States is currently going down with respect to partisan polarization. And if we don't solve this problem, it'll be really terrible for the United States. And therefore, the lesson that Australia can take is, as good as your system of preferential voting is, and it's so much better than what we do in the United States, it's not strong enough medicine to cure extreme polarization, whereas the Nansen system is. So you're doing fine because your polarization is not as bad as the United States. So preferential voting combined with compulsory voting and so forth is, holding democracy pretty much in a healthy place, relatively healthy place in Australia. At least that's my impression from where I stand and sit. But the United States is not in a healthy place, and we need some strong curative medicine. And so you can watch what's happening to us and realize that, you may need to tweak your own system if things get a little dicey.
So no place for smugness or complacency in these sorts of matters.
I would never be complacent about democracy. Is such a wonderful thing, but it's a living, breathing. Every living organism needs protection, and can't just sort of assume that everything's going to always go well. And disease can be always around the corner. And I mean, that's a metaphor, I guess, when we talk about the body politic. But so Australia's healthy now, but you might need a dose of vaccine to stay healthy.
Indeed. I mean, there have been some instances, haven't there? There was a Senate election that saw the gaming of preferences in the upper house a couple of elections ago, I think. Some very clever people figured out how they could make sure that their party was successful. And even in this recent election, which was widely sort of reported as a landslide, it's actually down to preferences in particular seats, and could easily have gone the other way, because preference deals are less and less certain than they used to be. So, yeah, this is a good caution. But anyway, perhaps you could tell us what you think the US should be taking from Australia, though. Or you think it's the Nansen, the social choice theory?
That's number one priority. I would love it if the United States could do compulsory voting. I just don't think that's in the cards. The libertarian psychology of America is just going to resent the idea of compulsory voting. And so You have to work in the realm of realistic. Whereas I do think some form of preferential voting is a realistic reform. There are a couple of states in the United States, Alaska and Maine, do versions of the basic method that Australia currently uses. So even though that's a difficult reform, it doesn't feel out of reach.
So staying on the topic of elections, one of the counterintuitive American institutions, at least from an Australian standpoint, is the Electoral College used in presidential elections. You know, if we think about your body politic analogy, this is a crusty old part of the American kind of constitutional body politic. And you've written on this topic, most notably in your book, Presidential Elections and Majority Rule, published with Oxford University Press. For our readers, and in fact, mainly our listeners and watchers rather than readers, but if you get a transcript of this, then you become a reader. Can you give us a brief overview of how the Electoral College works and how you think it should be reformed to work better?
I wish I could be brief. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but it is a very odd and complicated contraption. It was designed in the 18th century. Well, really to fit George Washington, our first president, was the way the original Electoral College was built. And it was an effort, it was part of the philosophy of the original Constitution to avoid the creation of political parties, if you can believe that. It was a complete failure right from the get-go. George Washington was revered enough that he could transcend partisan politics, at least for a little while. But after his 2 terms, partisanship became incredibly ugly in America. And as bad as things are right now, you could say that they were even worse in the 1790s. I won't go into all the details. The book, if people are interested, is a place to go for that. But we then had a second electoral college, if you can believe it, that was built around Thomas Jefferson, who was the 3rd American president. And because he won a very problematic election in the year 1800, and because the United States almost fell apart in 1800, they decided to rebuild the system in a new way. And the system was designed to create a version of majority rule, but a complicated version based on the notion of federalism. You know, the United States, the very name of the country, is a signal that it is this composite of state governments. And that's still true today. It was even more true back then, the power of the states relative to the federal government. So they didn't want just a unified system. They wanted it to be multi-level. Anyway, it too worked for a while and then fell apart. And the reason why I wrote the book is that when Donald Trump won in 2016, the first time, and I try to be nonpartisan in my analysis and just say, how does the system work? How is it supposed to work? How can it benefit all Americans? It struck me as odd that he was able to win the Electoral College, and not only did he not win the so-called national popular vote nationwide, that was sort of an obvious point, but the way he won the Electoral College was by winning states without a majority of vote in the significant states. So states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, you may have heard of, he was below 50% in these critical states that put him over the top in the Electoral College. Well, how is that? Is that consistent? Turns out that is the exact opposite of what the authors of the system wanted. They wanted you to build a national or federal level majority out of state level majorities. And so the book tells the story of how we lost our way, if you will, with what the original system was supposed to be. So you asked, well, what should we do now? My preference would actually be to get rid of the thing. Right. It's antiquated. We should just have a general national popular vote, frankly, built on the Nansen system if we could, but any national popular vote would be good, especially with some form of preferential voting. But if you're stuck with the Electoral College, at least rebuild the notion that you don't get all of it. You don't get all of Pennsylvania's electoral votes unless you have at least a majority within the state of Pennsylvania, and we don't even have that system.
Right. And how do we get from here to there?
Oh my goodness, that's the problem with America is our systems for reform and amendment are so brittle and so difficult. we're sclerotic, if you know that word. It's like our arteries are hardened when we're about to have a heart attack if we haven't had it already. So reform is a real challenge. It's got to be done on a state level. There are some states that allow for referenda, which means you just need a majority vote of all the citizens of the state. So if you can explain a reform cogently enough and simply enough, the citizens realize the need for it, there is some hope. That's how we've gotten reform in Maine and Alaska, as I mentioned already. So it's a slow, arduous process, but there's really no alternative but to try.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit? Are Maine and Alaska safe seats for one party or another, or not?
No.
Right? Alaska is not. Yeah.
Neither one. Maine is trending, what we call it blue in the United States, which means Democrats.
Yep.
And Maine is trending there. But for example, a prominent Maine Senator, Susan Collins, is a Republican, a moderate Republican. Watching her election and next year is going to be interesting.
Trouble,
yeah. Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, is nominally an independent. So Maine is quite an interesting state. Alaska even more so. It's more Republican or red than blue, but it's not so one-sided. Again, Lisa Murkowski is another more moderate Republican senator. So they're a little bit quirky states. They're not good models completely for the rest of the country, but they're also not completely one-sided.
And is that, do you think that being somewhat in the middle, if you like, is one of the reasons they were able to push through these reforms? If you have a heavily dominated state legislature, they're only going to want to make reforms in the interests of their own party, yeah?
Correct. And I do think that's right. My own view, again, for the sake of democracy as a whole, I think what America needs is a coalition, a bipartisan coalition of Democrats and the remaining Republicans who are not associated with Donald Trump. Because frankly, I do think Donald Trump is a danger. He has authoritarian tendencies. I think that's undeniable. And what disappoints me about America is that there hasn't been broad enough and deep enough of a coalition between the Democratic Party and the sort of non-Trump part of the Republican Party. There's been some of that, but not nearly enough.
That's a fascinating topic, but let's before we turn to polarization, which we will, let's talk about disputed elections, which is another topic on which you've published a great deal, including the book Ballot Battles, The History of Disputed Elections in the United States, again published with Oxford, a fascinating and important topic. Thinking about recent history, the 2020 election was shrouded in controversy because Donald Trump refused to accept his defeat, of course. He's never really backed away from that, and endorsement of this big lie has become a litmus test of MAGA credentials in the years since then. 2024, no big controversies that year, but perhaps only because Trump won. This history leads us to wonder, are you concerned about a disputed presidential election in 2028 and perhaps even the midterms next year? We hear about the gerrymandering that's alleged going on in the process of happening at the moment. How deep are your concerns?
Very. I'm very concerned both about the midterms and uniquely for the midterms for the first time. Midterms are important, but the pressure on them is unprecedented. You mentioned the gerrymandering. I think that is a signal of just how intense the fight is going to be in this round of midterms. So, as an election law scholar, we sort of have to focus on the midterms first and kind of get through that, hopefully intact, where people are entitled to vote as they should be and the ballots are counted fairly. As bad as gerrymandering is, and I think it's an awful cancer on our body politic, to go back to that metaphor, it concerns the rules of the game, how the game is played ahead of time. What that book Ballot Battles was about and what the fight over 2000, which was nonsensical because it shouldn't have happened, but that was fighting over the rules after the game has been played. And that's almost more dangerous for a democracy because there never is going to be absolutely perfect rules, but at least if you know the rules, you campaign accordingly and you try to win, but then trying to manipulate the counting of votes, that's just so dangerous.
And America has a long history of this kind of thing, as you point out in the book. But do you suspect, or is there evidence that these kinds of disputes are becoming more of an issue today than in the past?
Well, I would say prior to 2020, no. I mean, we had a turn in the United States in the year 2000. Some listeners may remember Bush versus Gore and the Supreme Court's involvement, and there were these things called hanging chads, which was this bizarre term related to a bizarre form of voting technology, or antiquated anyway. And ever since then, there's just been so much more intensity in fighting over the electoral rules, both ahead of time and after the fact. What happened in 2020, though, was really unprecedented in the sense that that the dispute was completely manufactured, and you used the phrase big lie, which I think is appropriate. All the disputes written in the first edition of Ballot Battles were genuine disputes. These were elections where there were plausible claims on both sides. What was 2020 was creating a complete fabrication, and that was something that was unseen and particularly dangerous.
So related to all of this, Ned, is the question of how people find out about the people they might vote for. Obviously, that's information, usually advertising, sometimes door-to-door, what have you. And the big contemporary challenge is what we call electoral disinformation, or again, we might just call it sometimes lying, but certainly disinformation or manipulation. So one state in Australia, South Australia, has in place some truth in advertising laws, which make it an offence to tell a lie during an election campaign. There's been some effort also to introduce these laws across the Australian Federation in different states. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about such laws, and could they have relevance for the United States?
It obviously is an incredibly important topic that has exploded in importance because of social media and so forth. The United States, given its First Amendment with its freedom of speech, has some jurisprudence that makes it very hard to criminalize political or campaign speech, even if it's lying. But there is room for a very narrow sliver of prosecution of deliberate lies that are defamatory, meaning they attack the reputation of a different candidate. And although there's some confusion about this in American law, I think the correct reading of the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions on this, allows for that very narrow criminalization of political speech. Even so, it's a dangerous weapon. I mean, putting people in jail for their campaign activity is something you want to be very careful about. If you're going to do it at all, the doctrines in the United States require, again, it has to be an absolute deliberate lie, it has to be proven beyond the reasonable doubt, and so forth. What was distinctive about Trump's big lie is it wasn't just one speech. It was an orchestration of an entire conspiracy to undo the results in a multifaceted way. So to me, I actually thought the right way to deal with Trump would have been to use the impeachment process successfully, which didn't happen. I did think the risk of attempting to put him in jail after the failure of impeachment could have a backlash. But as a pure matter of legal theory or law, I thought the criminal prosecution was consistent with our First Amendment.
Thank you. I mean, I think about the end of the Civil War, and I think we learned that you want to pursue those people who, for example, secede from the Union because the results are terrible otherwise. But yes, I take your point about the cost, the potential cost of doing so.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a risk that those sorts of laws in a polarized climate could be weaponized by either side. I mean, the consequences could be not the ones that we're anticipating, which could be.
Well, we're seeing that now in the United States. I mean, Trump's Justice Department is paneled a grand jury to go after Obama and his aides. So, yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, a lot of risks. Okay, let's turn to another area of contention in the United States, campaign finance, sometimes called party finance or political finance here in Australia, so the funding of elections and political parties. I'd be fascinated to know your current thoughts and assessment of campaign financing in the United States at the moment? Is the system broken, as many commentators say? And where do you think the promising reforms might lie?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I started my career as a professor working on the issue of campaign finance specifically and trying to develop a system of fair political finance that created as much equality for voters as possible. I've sort of left that area in part because I see other issues as urgent, but also the U.S. Supreme Court's jurisprudence in this topic has moved in an opposite direction of where my initial scholarship was, and more in the direction of making it impossible to legislate restrictions and regulations on campaign finance. It's not a move that I welcome. I don't think it really was a correct interpretation of the Constitution, but as a foreseeable matter, it's not going to be done anytime quickly. So, you can wish for utopia, and again, I think let's change America's faulty system in ways that we practically can. And unfortunately, campaign finance is not one that's practically fixable in the near future.
Very interesting. So you think nothing short of a constitutional amendment would suffice really to change the nature of that game?
Or new Supreme Court justices overruling precedent and coming up with a new jurisprudence.
Right.
But that's not on the horizon either.
No, not with this current Supreme Court. So if we could move you to a final topic, Ned. We've held you hostage for a while. Let's talk about polarisation, as we've sort of indicated we would. It seems to be, it's a word that we hear a lot, and when we compare it to Australia again, so Joseph Stiglitz, in his most recent visit here, said, you have the centre, and well done. Again, we're not going to be smug about this. I'm not. It has its own problems. But this is a real challenge for governance in the United States, right? So particularly at the moment, the transformation of the Republican Party, which I'd love to get your views on. This is a process that Trump has certainly accelerated, but he didn't start it. And is it the main driver of polarisation, the change to the Republican Party? And what are your thoughts also about a post-Trump Republican Party? What does that look like?
Well, I would say the change in the Republican Party is more a symptom of the problem, a manifestation of these underlying problems. To me, polarization in the United States is a product of two intersecting factors. One are cultural conditions that have changed for the worst over the last half century, including things like globalization causing economic displacement, America not getting a handle on its immigration policy, and the rise of social media and so forth. So all of these cultural factors have contributed immensely to the problem. But those cultural factors have interacted with institutional flaws. And it's the combination of cultural change and imperfect institutions which has led to where we are, which is the dangerous position. So again, one of the reasons why I come back to the Nansen method that I mentioned is it would be an institutional change that would undo polarization and create more of a center for technical reasons that we won't go into details here. I did a lecture at the University of Melbourne on this, which will go online in a little bit if people want to watch that. The other institution that really needs reform in the United States is what we call partisan primaries. So there are primary elections before the general election in the U.S., and primary elections are a political matter. And that is where Trump has developed a stranglehold on the Republican Party. You've got candidates who would win the general election who can't make it through the primary. In fact, the presidential election is an example of one. If you had eliminated partisan primaries and used Nansen's method of preferential voting, Nikki Haley would be the president of the United States today, not Donald Trump. Yes, a Republican repudiating Joe Biden's administration, and it wouldn't have been Kamala Harris, but it would have been America's first woman president, a woman of color. She would have been a Republican, but she would have been a more centrist Republican, not, Trump way out there. And that's, again, a product. There is a force within the United States, that maybe 40% of voters who want Trump, but that gets magnified through our bad institutions. There's the median voter in the United States wants a Nikki Haley Republican. the system delivers them a Trump Republican.
That's such an intriguing counterfactual, and perhaps the world would look rather different if we're speaking of President Haley. I can't help but wonder how we solve the problem of parties putting up candidates, though. I mean, if we're not going to have the partisan primary system, how do you imagine that Haley gets selected by the community to stand for election?
There's a couple of different institutional ways to do it. One possibility is to create a multi-party two-round system, something on the model of what France has. If you think about French presidential elections, there's a lot of parties that compete in round one. What France does is send two candidates to the second round. That's what we call in the United States a top two system. California has that. The state of Washington out west has that. That's pretty good. That like your system in Australia, preferential voting, that is something of a break on polarization. But it's not, again, it's not as strong enough medicine when polarization gets really bad. And looking at France, their next presidential election, they may end up the center not holding and going, one side or the other. If you had a top three system instead of a top two system and used the Nansen method of preferential voting in the second round, that would depolarize even more. So if you try to imagine adding the Nansen method at round two on what France does, you'd have a bunch of parties. And so Nikki Haley probably wouldn't try to be the nominee of the MAGA Trump party. And if it wasn't Nikki Haley, it would be other people in that lane. Larry Hogan, if that's a name that your listeners know, Chris Sununu up in New Hampshire, another more moderate Republican. So a well-designed system would invite a third centrist party that could actually be competitive, that can't compete in our current system.
Fantastic. I'm sure our listeners are enjoying this talk of institutions and the incentives they generate and different outcomes. And I think it's really helpful to always be reminded that politics isn't just about the individuals. It's also about the structures within which they compete. That said, I'm wondering if we can talk about an individual, since we don't very often have real Americans on the show. Let alone someone from Ohio, where Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran a very lively campaign in 2024 and is now actively campaigning for the governorship of the state. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on his likely future in the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's another great example of just what we're talking about, not at the level of presidential elections, although he did run for president, obviously, but running for governor of Ohio. It's replicating the same issue that we've been talking about. He's running in what we would call the MAGA lane or the Trump lane. There is somebody running against him in that leftover, old-style Republican Party, the grand old party or GOP. But that old lane, more middle lane, can't work under the current system. We saw this when J.D. Vance, Trump's new vice president, ran in the Trump lane against somebody in the old lane. And under a different system, Vance would have lost because he actually was not the candidate closest to the median voter. So Ramaswamy is going to benefit from this bad system in it precisely the same way that Vance did and Trump did. And we're going to repeat this again and again until we realize there's an institutional necessity for a different structure. And that's not to achieve a partisan goal. It's just what's the fairest way to have a democracy so all votes and voices are treated fairly. You want a system of majority rule and it's the hardest to do when there's polarization.
So you reckon his chances are quite good?
Yes, his chances are quite good. Yes, indeed.
Okay, on that note, we shall end things there. Professor Ned Foley, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Presidency Pending. It's been a truly illuminating discussion. We've covered many topics, and you've been insightful throughout. Thank you.
And thanks for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure for me as well.
You know what, though? I'm going totally off script here. We've got 5 extra minutes, so we might, if you're not like me and completely now obsessed with what the Nansen solution might be in some more detail, you can log off right now. But can we use 5 minutes to Can you give us a little more detail about what it is that so excites you about this system? And let's go right in the weeds, so only those listeners who really want to know can hang on.
Can we call this the postscript?
Yeah. Sure. So I hope most Australian listeners are familiar with the tabulation method associated with your system of preferential voting, because the Nansen system has the same ballots. From a voter's perspective, casting the ballots is exactly the same, no difference at all. It's just what do you do with the ballots? And the current system in Australia drops the candidate with the fewest first-place votes and then redistributes the ballot and you get the result. Well, I hope you can see that in an era of polarization where you've got 40% on the far right and 40% on the far left and 20% in the middle, you're going to drop the middle candidate in the current system, and you're going to replicate a polarized fight between far right and far left. What the Nansen system does is take the ballots and create what you may call a round-robin sports-style tournament among all the candidates, where each pair of candidates has a head-to-head contest. And you can do that with preferential ballots because on every ballot, for every two candidates, one's on top and one's below. So when you create that head-to-head round-robin competition, you can find a candidate who's actually preferred by a majority against each opponent. And in a world of polarization, that's often the centrist or middle candidate because they form a majority coalition of one side, 40% on one side plus the 20% in the middle, join to beat the other side, and 40% on the other side plus 20% in the middle join to beat the opposite side. So the Nansen method is inherently depolarizing by saying that the true majority is the candidate whom a majority prefer against each opponent one-on-one.
Okay, so I'm not a statistician. Does that mean that the person who is, say, the second favourite of the most people has a chance of winning?
Exactly.
Hey.
Bingo, you got it.
I've sat on enough prize committees to know that this is often what happens.
It's a way to achieve compromise.
Yeah.
It finds, right? I mean, again, it's in a world of polarization, there's a lot of first choices out there at either end of the polls, but there might be a second choice candidate that both sides can settle on.
Right, and can live with. And, possibly not storm any capitals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you if you don't mind coming back to the U.S. presidential election, maybe it feels a little intuitive that, again, many Democrats obviously wanted Kamala Harris, but, she campaigned with Liz Cheney, an anti-Trump Republican, so she would have told her voters, if you're my voters, vote for Nikki Haley second instead of, because we've got to stop Trump. And so that would have been a coalition of Democrats plus the Nikki Haley segment of voters against Trump. And then Trump's voters, being Republican, definitely don't want Kamala Harris, so they would have picked Nikki Haley second. So you're catching on to the Nansen idea.
I suspect there are more nuances, but we might have to leave it there for now. Thank you for taking the time to explain that to us, because we kept coming to it in the discussion. I just wanted to get a few more details.
And if I can put the plug for the lecture that brought me to Australia, there's something at the University of Melbourne called the Magunya Fellowship that delivers the Magunya lecture, and I think I don't think it's yet posted because it was delivered just a little bit ago. But I think in the next week or so, if you Google my name Foley and Magunya, which is difficult to spell, but hopefully you'll get there, and maybe a link eventually through this podcast. Then you can see lots of graphics and lots of details, and if you can go all in on Nansen if you really want to.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. All right. Well, thank you for taking the extra time, and to our listeners, thank you for joining us again on the pod. Please share it with your friends, families, and your nemesis if you like. Thanks again for your support, and we're looking forward to bringing you the rest of Season 2 shortly.